My name is Maya Chen. I am 27 years old. I work in startup finance, and I found out my sister had erased me from her own origin story on a Tuesday morning when a coworker dropped a business magazine on my desk and said, "Isn't this your sister?" It was. Full-page profile. Founders to watch. Lin Chen, 31, founder of a consumer wellness brand that had grown to $3 million in annual revenue in 4 years. The photo was good. The story was better. I read it twice. Nowhere in the story, not in the pull quote, not in the founding narrative, not in the section about how she got started with nothing, was my name. My money. My business model. The $18,000 I wired her on a Tuesday in October 4 years ago, with a signed agreement that gave me 15% of the company in exchange. She'd built her whole self-made story on a foundation I'd poured. And the magazine had printed it, and my coworker had dropped it on my desk with a smile, and I said, "Yeah, that's her," and I went back to work. Because my sister had made one enormous mistake, and she made it by forgetting that a wire transfer has a timestamp and a signed agreement has a signature and equity doesn't disappear because you stop talking about it. My 15% was still there. And 3 months later, when a larger company came to acquire Lin's brand, that 15% became a number with a lot of zeros behind it, and the acquisition documents named every stakeholder. Including me. Before I tell you what Lin's face looked like when the acquirer's lawyer said my name at the table, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether someone has ever built something on your money and then called themselves self-made. I want to see how far this story travels. I work in startup finance. I evaluate early-stage companies, their revenue projections, their burn rates, the numbers behind the pitch deck, the gap between what founders believe and what the spreadsheet says. My job is to be the person who reads past the story to the structure underneath. My family found this profoundly unsexy. Lin had the vision. The brand. The products lined up on a shelf. When she talked about her company at dinner, the family leaned forward. When I talked about mine, the spreadsheets, the models, the funding rounds, my mother's eyes moved toward her phone. That's fine. I'm used to it. What I wasn't used to was funding the vision and watching the storytelling erase the funding. I want to be fair. Lin built the thing. The product development, the brand identity, the customer relationships, the $3 million in revenue, those were hers. She has a talent for building things people want, which is not nothing. What she cannot do, never could do, is run a number. When she came to me 4 years ago, she had a concept, a supplier contact, and negative $12,000 in her checking account. She did not have a financial model, a cash flow projection, or any understanding of how her pricing would affect her margins. She had a dream and a deficit. I gave her the model and the money. $18,000, my savings, 2 years of careful putting away on a junior analyst's salary, and a signed agreement on a template I pulled from work. 15% equity, founder's stake, her company, my investment. Clean. Documented. She called it a loan from family. She still does, sometimes, when she talks about how she started with nothing. There were 3 moments I never let myself feel until that magazine. At year 1, when the business turned its first profit, Lin called me and said, "We did it." We. She used we. I thought about that we for a long time afterward, because it meant she hadn't erased me yet. I was still in the story, just invisibly. At year 2, at a family dinner, an uncle asked how the company got started and Lin said, "I just decided to go for it. Scraped everything together and just went." I was sitting across the table. She looked at me while she said it, and kept looking, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything. That look was an agreement. I understood it only in retrospect. And at year 3, when the Founders to Watch profile came out, she sent the family a link with a caption that said "so grateful and humbled," and she did not send it to me directly. I got it from our mother's forward. Each moment was warmer on the surface than it should have been. Each one taught me the same lesson, that Lynn's self-made story was a decision she'd been making incrementally for 4 years, shaving a little more of the truth away each time, until by year 4 there was nothing left of me in her origin and she'd probably stopped noticing the absence. Let me tell you what I actually did with the magazine, because it tells you who I am. I read it. I felt the thing I felt. And then I opened the signed agreement on my computer, the one from 4 years ago, saved in a folder I've never needed to open, and I read it too. And then I pulled up the wire transfer confirmation and I looked at the date and the amount and my sister's account number in the recipient field. And I put it all in a folder I labeled Lynn Equity File, and I closed my laptop and I went to lunch. I did not post. I did not call her. I did not text the family. I did not call the magazine with a correction. Because I work in finance, and I have learned that the person who disputes an acquisition before the acquisition closes is the person who loses the acquisition. And I had just read, in the same startup finance news I read every morning, that Lynn's company was in acquisition talks with a wellness conglomerate. My 15% had never gone anywhere. It was just about to be worth something. The acquisition process took 3 months. I watched it from a distance, the way you watch something you're part of but not supposed to be part of. I should explain what happens to equity in an acquisition. Every stakeholder has to be identified, verified, and paid out or rolled over. You cannot acquire a company without accounting for all the shares. Acquirers hire lawyers specifically to find the shares that the founders forgot about or hoped nobody would mention. They found mine. I got an email from the Acquirers Council 4 weeks into the process. Subject line, Lin Chen Brand, Stakeholder Verification. They had the agreement. They had found it in the company's incorporation documents, which Lynn's lawyer had filed correctly 4 years ago even if Lynn had stopped thinking about them. They needed me to verify my stake and confirm I would consent to the acquisition. I replied the same day. I said I would consent. I said I was happy to cooperate fully. I said I appreciated being contacted directly. I did not call Lynn. I let the process be the process. She called me 2 days later, at 7 p.m., and I could hear in her voice the exact moment she'd learned. She said, "The acquirer's lawyer called me about you." And I said, "Yes." She said, "You're in the cap table." And I said, "I've been in the cap table since the agreement we signed 4 years ago." 15%. You have a copy in your email. I have mine. The silence lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "I forgot." And I said the sentence I'd say again exactly the same way. I said, "Lynn, you gave a magazine interview about building your company from nothing, and your silent partner read it at her desk. You didn't forget. You decided to tell a different story. And that's okay. I understand why the self-made story is better than the one where your little sister funded it and modeled the cash flow. But the agreement didn't forget, and the wire transfer didn't forget, and the acquisition documents don't care what story we tell at dinner. I'm in the cap table. I've always been in the cap table. You just stopped saying so. Here is where the story becomes a choice. I could have blocked it. Not easily, not without a fight, but 15% is not nothing, and a stakeholder who refuses to consent can complicate an acquisition in ways that are expensive for everyone. I had leverage that the self-made founder story had spent 4 years pretending I didn't have. I thought about using it. I thought about calling the acquirer's lawyer and saying I had concerns. I thought about what it would cost Lynn to have a deal stall because the silent partner she'd publicly erased had decided to make herself visible at exactly the moment it hurt most. And then I did the math, which is what I do, and the math was clear. My 15% at the acquisition valuation was more than I'd earn in several years at my current job. It was, in fact, the seed for the company I'd been meaning to start for 3 years. Using my stake as a weapon would have cost me the stake. And the stake was the thing. I consented to the acquisition. Fully, without conditions, the same week. I did ask for one thing. Not from Lynn, from the acquirer. I asked, as part of my consent documentation, that any future promotional material about the brand's founding history accurately reflect the role of founding investors. It's a standard clause. They agreed without discussion. I took my payout. I started my company. I did not call Lynn to announce it. She called me, 2 months after close. Her voice was different, not small, exactly, but careful in the way of someone choosing words they've been preparing. She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something." I waited. She said, "You built the model I ran for 4 years. You gave me the money when I had nothing. I know that." I knew it the whole time and I stopped saying it because, and she stopped. And I said, because the self-made story was better. And she said, yes. Because the self-made story was better, and every year I told it a little more and the other version got smaller, and eventually I just lived in the better story. Until the lawyer called. She said, "I'm sorry." Without a frame. Without an explanation folded into it. Just that. And I said, "I know. And I used the payout to start my own company, so I think we're even." She laughed, a short, real sound, and said, "What's it called?" And I told her. And she asked what it did. And I explained it. And she listened, and asked good questions, and at no point did her eyes move to her phone, because we were on a phone and also because she finally knew I was a person worth listening to about money. That was the beginning of something, I think. Not the end of something. My mother needed the longest explanation, because silent partner is not a concept that lands in a single conversation. I explained it 3 times over 3 different phone calls. By the 3rd call she understood it, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "So you made money when Lynn's company sold?" And I said yes. And she said, "And nobody knew you were part of it?" And I said that was the definition of silent. And she said, "Why didn't you say something when she did the magazine?" And I said, "Because the acquisition was coming, and I knew the documents would say it for me." And she said, "That's very clever." Which is the first time my mother has said that to me and not to Lynn, and I decided to let it sit on the shelf and not make too much of it. I keep the wire transfer confirmation in a frame on my desk now. Not the agreement, that's filed where agreements belong. The wire transfer confirmation. Date, amount, recipient, and a memo field where I typed, because I was 23 and sincere, for the dream. Pay it back in equity. She paid it back. The acquirer cut the check. And I used it to build the next thing, because that's what you do with a foundation you've been quietly laying for 4 years while someone else was busy being self-made. They called her the self-made founder. It turned out self-made had a silent partner, and the silent partner had been doing this for a living. So if there's someone in your life who's taken your money, or your idea, or your foundation, and called themselves self-made while you watched from the footnotes, ask yourself one thing tonight. What's in the agreement? What's in the wire transfer? What's in the document they signed and forgot, because they were busy building the story and you were busy building the thing? Because self-made is a story. Equity is a fact. And facts don't care about the version of the story that photographs best. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Every character and event in it is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. But if any of it felt familiar, I hope it leaves you with this: document your contribution, even when you're sure you won't need to. The person who gives quietly without a record is the person whose gift gets rounded down to a loan, and then to help, and then to nothing. Keep the receipt. Not as a weapon, as a fact. Because the difference between being erased and being found is almost always a piece of paper nobody thought to throw away.